Welcome to Sharpe Insights, conversations with your plan giving experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to Sharpe Insights, conversations with your plan giving experts. I'm your host, Grant Miller. Donor-advised funds have become one of the most popular options for charitable giving. They offer flexibility, tax advantages, and a way to build a legacy of philanthropy. In this episode, we'll examine the growing importance of donor-advised funds and what development professionals should understand to effectively engage with donors who have them. Our featured guest today is Sarah Barba. Sarah specializes in the intersection of philanthropy and tax policy and has published work in Bloomberg Tax, Trust and Estates, and Wealth Management. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, let's just start with the basics today. What is a donor-advised fund, and why have they become such a popular charitable giving vehicle?
A donor-advised fund is a giving tool, which is sponsored by a public charity. Some in the field like to think about it similar to a charitable giving account or a charitable savings account. And the way that works is a donor will make a deductible contribution into a donor-advised fund, give up control of those assets, meaning they can never get them back or receive a personal benefit from those assets because they've now been committed to charity. And then they retain an advisory privilege through which they can make recommendations to the sponsoring charity for what other 501c3 nonprofits that charity will grant funds to that are in that donor-advised fund account. And we've seen more and more donors choose this DAF tool, both in concert with other charitable giving vehicles like trusts and private foundations. But for some donors, it is the only way that they give money away to charity now, largely because of that flexibility and ease of use that the tool offers to folks who want to move money efficiently to nonprofits.
So basically the factors that are driving the growth and popularity of donor-advised funds over the last few years are, would you say, flexibility and simplicity? Is that right?
Yeah, low overhead is a huge reason that donors choose donor-advised funds. They are a lot less expensive to maintain as a donor compared to some other types of giving vehicles like private foundations. And the interesting part is that donor-advised funds have actually existed for about 100 years in some form, but their growth has really increased over the last 30 years as more financial advisors have come into the charitable giving conversation, and more financial institutions have adopted philanthropic policies into their practice as advisors to clients.
That's fascinating. I had no idea they'd been around for so long. I thought they were a pretty recent invention in the world of plan giving. Do you know why they took so long to take off, I guess?
I'm sure for a number of reasons. First and foremost being the internet, right? It's given a lot of folks access to more knowledge and sophisticated giving tools, but it's also been a way to share insights into how different things work. It's also likely because the original donor-advised funds existed at community foundations or community trusts. And those are organizations still to this day that host and offer donor-advised funds. But over the last 30 years, more and more financial institutions have set up sister organizations in the nonprofit space in order to have more nationally based donor-advised funds versus those community-based community foundation and community trust donor-advised funds that we saw come to be back in the 1930s.
Fascinating. I love an origin story. So from a donor's point of view, what are the main benefits of giving through a donor-advised funds versus another type of charitable gift?
We've already laid a few of those out, and I will not putting these in order of how donors choose donor-advised funds, mostly because it depends on the donor. But for one, that simplicity and flexibility that we talked about is a huge component here. When you give into a donor advised fund, you take a single charitable deduction and you have a single receipt that you need to share with the IRS to get your charitable deduction in April. But you can then use those funds to support multiple different charities. So it's this way of streamlining your deductibility of your giving and then being able to thoughtfully grant out to multiple charities. It also gives donors the ability to gift complex assets that not all charities can accept. So more and more, especially as we enter what will be the next 20 to 30 years of this great wealth transfer, where about $80 trillion is going to change hands. A lot of those assets are going to be in non-cash form, whether it's real estate or appreciated stock or private business. So donor advised funds are uniquely positioned to accept complex assets and help donors liquidate those into cash that they can then dole out to nonprofit beneficiaries. And finally, I'd say the overhead piece that I mentioned before, where there's a lot less work involved in grant making through a donor advised fund, the public charity that hosts the donor advised fund is the one that takes care of compliance and ensuring that grantees are in good standing with the IRS and that there's no personal benefit being derived from a DAF grant, which makes it less costly on the donor and streamlines the compliance process versus other forms like a private foundation, where not only does a donor have to go through all of the compliance requirements of a private foundation if they're involved, but they also have to handle hiring staff and using nonprofit resources to pay that staff.
Okay. So I was made the host of this podcast because I've been working with Sharpe for about 5 years and realized that I'm still kind of a novice on the complex world of planned giving. So they let me ask some of the more obvious questions. And one is there a limit through a donor advised fund on how many nonprofit organizations you can give to? Or is there any reason why someone would set up multiple donor advised funds, or is it just a one size fits all kind of gift?
There are definitely reasons why folks would use different donor advised fund sponsors for their giving through DAFs. First of all, if you go through a community foundation, the community foundation sponsor itself is going to have a deep knowledge of a geographic area and needs and nonprofits within that area. But you also are giving to a charity who's taking ownership of that money, and they can exert control over saying yes or no to your recommendations. So there may be an organization through which you have a donor advised fund, but a grant you want to make does not align with the mission of that organization. It could be as simple as you want to give outside of your community, and the community foundation limits its grant making to a certain geography. So there are some reasons why folks would maybe set up multiple at different organizations because of who they want to grant to. On the flip side, they could set up multiple because of who they want to give advisory privileges to. And we've seen more and more donors use donor advised funds to teach next generation donors how to be philanthropic. So there are some donors out there who will set up multiple donor advised funds and then give advisory privilege to their grandchildren and use this as a tool to teach them how to be generous and how to be thoughtful through their grant making for the future when they do maybe come into more wealth through this wealth transfer and already have an idea of what their personal charitable missions are and can learn this culture of charitable giving that our country prides itself on.
Awesome. So, you mentioned the great wealth transfer and us millennials and such are going to start contributing more to organizations that we care about. Who is using donor advised funds now? Is it mostly just younger generations, or are members of the silent generation, are they using donor advised funds?
It is largely baby boomers that are using donor advised funds, but the use of them does span generations, actually all the way down to Gen Z and up to the silent generation. The adoption of them really took place as baby boomers were coming into more wealth. the increased adoption of them. And so that's where we see a lot of the use, but they are a tech tool too, right? Because you can put your assets into a donor advised fund and then go online and at the click of a button, make a grant recommendation. So I do expect more uptake of them through the millennial and Gen Z populations, but they're for everyone and they're not just for wealthy taxpayers. We see a lot of folks use them as their entrance into charitable giving. And that's why we're seeing a lot of the sponsoring organizations either reduce or eliminate their minimum contribution requirement to set up a donor advised fund so that they're accessible to everybody.
Okay. Again, you keep using the term recommendation for grants. And we mentioned earlier that some organizations may not want a certain donation from a donor for some reason or another. So what exactly do you mean by recommendations and recommending grants?
That all comes down to the legal treatment of the assets in a donor advised fund. And at the end of the day, the sponsoring charity owns that money, meaning they make the ultimate call of where they're going to direct that money. So this advisory privilege is what keeps donors coming back to donor advised funds, but it is only a privilege. That is why I keep using the word recommendation, because they typically will make that recommendation to the sponsoring charity and the sponsoring charity will make a grant. But if it doesn't align with a certain giving policy that charity laid out when they set up the donor advised fund in the first place, or if it has changed considerably over the last several years in terms of which charities it's comfortable giving to and comfortable associating its name with, then they can absolutely deny grants. So that's why I'm saying recommendation rather than directive or the donor themselves making the grant, because it's no longer the donor making a grant. It is the charity that they gave their money away to that will be making the grant ultimately.
Awesome. That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. That's I've heard recommended for years now, and it just now occurred to me to really dig into what exactly that meant. So thank you for clarifying that. So donor advised funds, they're simple for donors to use and to donate to organizations they care about. What about on the nonprofit end? Is it just as easy for nonprofits to receive and steward these gifts, or are there any specific challenges there for those organizations?
So receiving isn't a huge problem. DAFs sponsoring charities can cut checks fairly quickly once they go through their due diligence process of approving those recommendations that we discussed. They do have to go through that process, though, before they can send the funds to ensure that it's going to an IRS-approved 501c3 charity that's in good standing and that it complies with their internal policies, if there are any additional compliance policies within the organization. But what we do hear from some nonprofits is that they don't always know who the original donor advisor is when they receive a DAF grant, which makes it harder for them to share progress or success of their programs with that original donor. Some donors actually choose DAFs for that reason because they want the anonymity. That's not all. It's not even close to a majority, but there is a small portion of donors who choose it for that reason. So I can understand that it's frustrating for nonprofits who are trying to steward the donor and perhaps ask for more funds in the future. But it's also a big benefit to add to the list of why donors choose the donor advised fund form of giving, because it's not necessarily directly associated with them, but is associated with that charity that they made the initial gift to, which gets back to that legal control point and why a beneficiary charity may see the name of the sponsor in the subject line of the grant versus the name of the original donor.
Okay, yeah. A sentence I write a lot in the copy that I provide is, please let us know if you are directing a gift through a DAF. So that's interesting, and that makes sense why that would be the case, because some donors do prefer anonymity there. So let's get to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Lots of changes on the horizon. Are there any changes to donor advised funds specifically that donors and nonprofits should be aware of, and how might that affect how a donor might give this year end 2025 as opposed to next year?
So the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and as some in DC are calling it, OB3. And this bill itself made a ton of changes to tax policy. And I'd say the nonprofit sector in general came out as a mixed bag. There were a lot of policies initially that were proposed that didn't end up making it into the final bill that would have had negative impacts on charitable giving specifically. But donor advised funds as a tool fared pretty well in this bill. And by fared well, I mean they weren't directly targeted. There is one provision that renewed and expanded and made permanent the non-itemizer charitable deduction. So right now, under 2025 tax law, only itemizing taxpayers can deduct their charitable gifts, but going forward in 2026 and beyond, non-itemizers will also have the ability to deduct up to $1,000 if they're a single filer or $2,000 if they are filing jointly in cash gifts to charity. But donor advised funds are excluded from that current incentive. And the reason for that is the language that Congress used to renew this deduction was from the temporary non-itemizer charitable deduction that was implemented in 2020 and 2021 on a temporary basis in response to COVID. So they excluded donor advised funds then because they viewed the need for this deduction as a way to move money into the hands of operating charities very quickly. And some in Congress don't believe that donor advised funds move the money as quickly as just direct gifts to non-DAF charities. So they used that language again, which is why we see that exclusion of donor advised funds. But that was really the only mention of donor advised funds in the One Big Beautiful Bill. Though they weren't mentioned, there are a number of provisions that are going to take effect in 2026 that I believe will drive more donors to the donor advised fund vehicle, especially at the end of this year. There were a couple floors put into place, a floor on charitable deductions for itemizing individuals, which is at 0.5% of their adjusted gross income, which means that they have to give up to that 0.5% of their adjusted gross income before they can start deducting their charitable giving above that. So the government is now raising revenue on that first chunk of charitable giving that every taxpayer is making because they're not able to deduct it until they hit a certain amount of their income. There's also a limitation on the top end of itemized deductions that limits the value of the deduction to 35 cents for every dollar deducted, which means it's going to hit taxpayers that are in the highest income category who currently pay 37% federal income tax. So those taxpayers right now under current law, for every dollar they deduct, they will have a 37-cent benefit. But going forward, it will be 35 cents, which is 2 cents on the dollar. It doesn't seem like a lot, but when you are making large gifts, the margins matter from a tax planning perspective. So because of that, there will be changes to the value of the charitable deduction starting in 2026, which means many donors right now are looking at filling up their tub of charitable assets through a donor advised fund before the end of this year so that they can then have those assets available to grant out to the charities that they would have supported going forward into 26 and 27 and 28, but they don't have to take the tax hit that they otherwise would if they waited to make those contributions under the OB3 policies that will go into effect on January 1.
All right. Thanks for clarifying a pretty complex bill. It's Big Beautiful Bill, not the Big Simple Bill. Have you seen any or noticed any common misconceptions about the OB3 among donors or nonprofits, or any confusion there that you might want to clear up?
Sure. There are a lot of writings, articles, presentations going around, both trying to help practitioners understand the law so they can better communicate with potential donors, but then also helping donors themselves understand the law. And ultimately, I think some of the misconceptions are around some of those provisions that I mentioned before that were included in the original proposed bill that were not made into final law. For example, there was a provision that would have significantly increased taxes on private foundations in the original bill that did not make it into the final bill, though I have seen a number of writings that have suggested the private foundation excise tax has changed in OB3. There are also some more confusing representations of that cap on the itemized deductions that I mentioned, and suggesting that it is a 35% cap on AGI for charitable deductions, which, as we all know, the AGI cap for cash gifts to public charities was increased to 60% in 2017, and that AGI cap was made permanent in this bill. The 35% cap is on the value of the deduction, not on the amount of income you can deduct. Does that make sense?
I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
I might have to go back and re-listen one more time, but I'm going to say yes.
Okay. So ultimately, the way in which this bill was written was complex. It's thousands of pages of legislative language that is written in tax code language. So it's not always clear, but what is going to be interesting is to see the guidance that comes out from the IRS and Treasury Department that will help taxpayers understand in plain English how to comply with the new provisions versus what we are currently trying to understand from the legislative language.
Okay. Thanks for clearing some of those misconceptions up for folks. What about long-term planning? We talk a lot about blended gifts and the way that gifts interplay with each other and intersect with each other. Are there any particular ways that donor-advised funds intersect with other gifts, bequests or trusts or any other giving strategies?
That is a loaded question. Yes, the DAFs are one of many tools used in planning. I like to remind folks that a DAF is not an organization. It is a tool within an organization to help someone do their giving, just like a bequest or a trust. And they're a good choice when a donor knows that they are comfortable to give up full legal control for a certain mission. But they can also interact because the assets in a DAF can be left to a specific charity at the death of a donor. And that is typically set up with the DAF sponsoring organization when the account is initially funded. They will give most organizations some directives of where to either move advisory privileges or where to ultimately grant any funds that are left in the donor advised fund should the donor pass. But they are also used, as I mentioned before, to help next generations. So the gift planning being done is not just a plan for when a donor passes to move money to a certain mission, but also to sustain a legacy that the donor hopes to either create or continue through their donor advised fund giving, which they will also do through bequests of their IRA assets or through charitable trusts. So it's one of many tools to answer your question that help in that long-term planning.
Great. And so donor advised funds have been around for a while. They've only become increasingly popular in the last few decades. Do you see donor advised funds continuing to grow and reshape charitable giving, or is there anything else on the horizon that's going to swoop in and replace it? And what should fundraisers do to prepare for a future of popular donor advised funds or whatever's on the horizon?
In light of the recent bill, the OBBBA, the short answer is yes, donor advised funds will continue to grow. As of now, I believe their value lies in donors' ability to time their giving with what works best for them and then smooth out grant recommendations over time if that's how they choose to use it. If you hear of a new emerging tool, I would love to know about it. But for now, I think the donor advised fund tool is the fastest growing and one of the most efficient to achieve effective charitable giving quickly with low overhead. But the more that donors use donor advised funds, especially if they are trying to reduce their tax liability or any scrutiny of other tools that they might use, the larger the spotlight on DAFs is going to grow. And we've already seen scrutiny of this tool over the last several decades, both from Congress and outside voices trying to influence Congress to limit the use of donor advised funds. So as they grow in use, we can expect that scrutiny to come on along with it. That doesn't mean that they will go away. It doesn't mean that critics will successfully stymie their growth, but it just means that will continue to be a consideration for donors who are using them and nonprofits who are relying on gifts from them. But from that nonprofit fundraiser perspective, I believe donor advised funds are here to stay. I think I've made that very clear, and more donors will use them because of that ease of use and efficiency. So for the fundraisers who are out there, I think fighting the growth could turn some donors off who are really excited about the use of a donor advised fund. And I'd recommend working with donors and prospects to maximize their impact by using their donor advised funds to give. And that's going to really win the day for fundraisers in my mind. DAF donors aren't some secret club. They are everyday donors and prospects who many fundraisers are probably already talking to. So bringing up donor advised funds in the conversation is, in my mind, the easiest way to tap into those resources. But incorporating a conversation around donor advised funds, whether it's directly with donors or even in how you solicit funds as a fundraiser through more technology and contact via email or social media or text or whatever it is going to be the best way to kind of trigger in a donor's mind, oh, good, I can use my dollars that I've already set aside for charity to support this group.
Okay. So for plan giving professionals who might be a little trepidatious about the donor advised fund, they just kind of need to buckle up and get with the program and not go anywhere because donor advised funds are here to stay.
And, have more conversations with donors about them. Because there are, of course, the obvious uses of donor advised funds to just make a grant into a nonprofit, but there are also other ways to plan how those assets are going to be used over time to create a legacy, whether it's while the donor is living or once they pass and bequeath it. So there are a lot more opportunities to bring up legacy with DAFs because donor advised fund donors are inherently sophisticated in their generosity because they're choosing this tool. And there's a reason they choose a donor advised fund. I always say, you are still 40 cents less rich when you give away $1 to charity, even if you save, up to 60 cents in capital gains and income taxes. So ensuring that we recognize these donors chose a DAF for a reason, and we can probably capitalize on that reason as a fundraiser to help them create that legacy that they clearly started already through their charitable giving.
Okay. So in this field, as in all fields and as in all parts of life, some of us are better at some things than other things. Like, for example, I think I'm much better working with donors and talking to donors and telling their stories than I am with interpreting tax legalese. And so a lot of us really need people like you to help us interpret these bills and such. And I'm just curious, how did you end up getting into this line of work?
Well, it was a confluence of luck and good timing. I started this work by working at a tax and financial services policy firm in Washington, D.C., that happened to have a couple clients in the nonprofit space, and a partner at the firm and I clicked, and we decided to not only focus a lot of our energy on those nonprofit clients, but grow that portfolio because we saw an absence of voices in Washington, both working on behalf of the nonprofit sector, but then also interpreting Washington back to the nonprofit sector. So we have focused a lot of this growing practice over the last decade on not just being on the Hill and advancing legislation, but making sure that those who are going to be impacted by that legislation can understand the ins and outs of how Congress is viewing their work, in some cases, how Congress isn't even thinking about their work, and then consider and present opportunities for how they can raise their profile and make sure that when legislation like OB3 is being considered, there is a seat at the table for nonprofits.
Well, thank you. We appreciate you. I have one final question. So anytime new phraseology or ways of talking about things, you mentioned donor advised funds were not brand new. I thought they were a lot newer than they are. But there's always issues amongst nonprofit organizations and proofreaders, grammatical purists, many clients, writers. So I just got to know, are you pro-hyphen or anti-hyphen?
In donor advised fund?
Yeah, between the donor and the advised.
I'm pro-hyphen.
Pro-hyphen. I like that because we've had lots of back and forth, and I'll send some copy to an organization and they'll send it back and they'll just be kind of like, what are you doing here? And I'll be like, well, some people don't like the hyphen and some people do. So I'm glad that we cleared it up. It's good to hear it from you.
Thank you for the opportunity to weigh in on something grammatical because my background is in journalism and editing. So I have very strong feelings about hyphens and commas and well-placed punctuation.
As do I. And, her screen is off, but I can tell that our content editor and producer, Ashley McGee, is behind there with lots of thoughts and things to say about this. We'll save that for another episode. But thanks for your input there. We really appreciate it. So donor advised funds, they're not just a trend. For fundraisers, the key is understanding how donor advised funds work, how to steward donors well, and how to position your organization to receive these gifts effectively. Thanks so much to our guest, Sarah Barba. Sarah, we really appreciated having you here, and thanks so much for your insight and expertise.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Sharpe Insights, conversations with your plan giving experts. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe and share it with your colleagues in the field. Until next time, I'm Grant Miller.
Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpegroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.